My name is Hannah, and this is my year of less stuff. Hey y'all, hi. So, for a while now, I have been wanting to share with you some thoughts I've been having about the relationship between makeup and fantasy. And that's what I'm going to do in today's video. I have some notes and I'm going to use the notes to start the conversation. There has been such good conversation going on in the comment section underneath my video about the relationship between makeup and shame. So I decided to approach this topic in the same way. I have made a list of the different kinds of fantasy that surround makeup and that are intertwined with the use of makeup. This is just me making a list off the top of my head. I'm just going to share my list with you and talk about what I've been thinking about with this list, and then we can continue the conversation together in the comments. If this is your first time to my channel, welcome. I'm Hannah. I am a passionate lover of beautiful things, but I don't want to have too much stuff, and I also don't want to spend too much of my money on beautiful things. That's something that I did in the past, and it took me a long time to recover from that. So I try to keep a balance here on my channel. If that kind of content sounds good to you, I hope that you'll go ahead and subscribe to my channel. Now let's go ahead and get into the meat of this video. So this is another discussion of makeup from another angle, and I found when I sat down to make the notes for this one that in many ways it's actually a more complex topic than makeup and shame, because shame is pretty universally acknowledged to be an unpleasant emotion to feel. We were talking about the ways in which this unpleasant emotion surrounds makeup, but fantasy is more complex than that. Fantasy can have pros and cons depending on how the word is employed and really depending on the nature of the action in which you're engaging, the action that we're labeling as fantasy. The primary definition, the dictionary definition of fantasy, is that it is the faculty for or the activity of imagining things. And that sounds great. The imagination is wonderful. It's not unpleasant to think about the faculty for or the activity of imagining things. But as we all know, the word fantasy can be used and is often used to imply that the things that you're imagining are impossible or improbable. And the connotation there isn't so positive. It's a connotation of delusion. So the list that I made of the kinds of fantasy that surround makeup, they fall into both categories. Some of them have the positive aspects of the way that we use the word fantasy, some of them have the negative, and some of them seem kind of mixed. So I just want to keep that in mind as we're going through, that there's fantasy, there's imagination, and there's manifesting of one's dreams, and then there's fantasy, like delusional fantasy of the impossible, or using fantasy to not see what's really there. So these are the types of fantasies that I came up with. This list is by no means exhaustive. This was just me brainstorming. I'm not writing some sort of academic tract here. I, again, just want to get the conversation started. So first on my list, and this might not surprise some of you, the fantasy of perfection. I think that the purchase of makeup, the use of makeup, the dream of what makeup will give you is often wrapped up in the fantasy that makeup can be used to make you perfect, or at least to make you look perfect. I think that sometimes we tie looking perfect with being perfect, especially in the eyes of others, but we're going to get into being XYZ way in others of the bullet points on my list. So maybe what I'm actually talking about here first on the list is the fantasy of physical perfection. We trick ourselves into believing that makeup can actually erase flaws and imperfections, cover them up, and make it like they were never there in the way that you can do in Photoshop, but you cannot do in real life. It actually isn't real. You cannot achieve physical perfection with makeup. What you can achieve is being yourself the way that you woke up with makeup on top of your skin. And that makeup might make you look slightly different at a glance, but you just cannot achieve actual physical perfection with makeup. But maybe the fantasy of physical perfection for many people isn't that delusional. It's something slightly short of that, which is the fantasy that one can create the illusion of actual physical flawlessness with the use of cosmetics. But I find that in many cases, that too isn't actually as possible as we like to believe it is. It's not as possible as we like to fantasize that it is. And I think it's worth mentioning here that I personally believe that photoshopped imagery on social media and in advertisements is responsible for fueling this persistent fantasy of physical perfection as it relates to makeup. We have been led to believe that a kind of flawlessness is possible in person, but we only ever have seen that flawlessness in pictures. And we look at ourselves in person and we feel like that flawlessness isn't possible. But we look at the pictures and we believe it is, and then we're led to believe that the thing that can leap that gap for us is makeup. In fact, the thing that leaps that gap is Photoshop. Real flawlessness in real life with makeup, it just doesn't work that way. Take it from someone who uses beauty lights sometimes, who sometimes fixes imagery on her phone to post on her social media accounts. It's just not a thing. And I can also tell you, I have seen all these influencers at events. Not all of them. I'm not like going to events where I'm running into Jaclyn Hill or something like that. But I see influencers at events. I see their made up faces and I see what that makeup that you put on your face to make yourself look like makeup has made you look flawless in your picture, what that actually looks like in person. In person, it doesn't look like makeup has made you look flawless. It looks like you're wearing a lot of makeup and it's a look. In pictures, it makes you look like makeup has made you look flawless, but that's a fantasy. Let's move on. Second on my list is the fantasy of desirability. I decided to lump a bunch of things that I thought about into this one category. So sexual attractiveness is one thing I thought of, the fantasy of sexual attractiveness. And I also thought of the fantasy of looking correct or looking right for your role, like for your job or for your parents if they're judging you, or for your friends or whoever it is, like whatever's going on with you in your life. There's this fantasy of desirability, that you'll be a more desirable whatever, a more desirable worker, a more desirable partner, a more desirable friend, and that makeup will get you there. There is so much pressure to be desirable in so many ways. And I think that so many women feel like we're fighting an uphill battle to be desirable in any given one of those ways. It feels like an uphill battle because the standards for desirable womanhood are literally impossible. And so it's like hard enough to even be climbing that hill. But when we fantasize about certain kinds of makeup, when we fantasize about makeup we might buy, makeup we might wear, makeup looks we might make, and I think sometimes even in the act of putting on makeup that we have, there's fantasy about increasing our desirability. And in the moment of applying it or buying it or dreaming about buying it when it comes out, in those moments of fantasy about the way in which the makeup will increase our desirability, we feel like we might get to the top. We feel like we might get to the top of this insurmountable mountain. We believe briefly in the promise, the false promise that it's ever possible to check all of the boxes of perfectly desirable womanhood. So many of those boxes are double standards against each other, or they create double standards when stacked up against each other, which is why it's an insurmountable mountain, which is why it's not possible. But with makeup, we live in the fantasy for the moment, the fantasy of desirability, and it's very, very compelling. Third on my list, I have the fantasy of natural beauty. So I wanted to talk about the act of using makeup to create a no makeup look. It's the fantasy of finding a way to use makeup to make it look like you look a certain way naturally, to make it look like you really did wake up like that. This fantasy really plucks on the tension, the strings of tension that are in the double standard wherein we are expected to look a certain way, like we're expected to look photoshopped, but we're shamed for trying, like we're shamed for wearing makeup and buying it and working on ourselves. Or we are expected to look beautiful, but we're not expected to have done anything to look beautiful. We're not expected to know that XYZ makes us more beautiful in the eyes of other people. You don't know you're beautiful. That's what makes you beautiful, right? That double standard really fuels this idea, this fantasy of using makeup to achieve a beauty that appears to be natural. Certain makeup brands like Glossier, really cater to this specific fantasy. One could even argue that they build up this fantasy and then cater to it. And a lot of skincare brands also cater to this specific fantasy. The promise that a certain skincare product will make you more naturally beautiful, and then you really will have woken up like that. That promise sells a lot of skincare. And I know we're not talking about skincare in this video, we're talking specifically about makeup, but I felt like it was worth sticking that in. Ooh, now we're getting into a really juicy one that I have a particular interest in. The fantasy of wealth. And I think that this one's also a little bit more hidden. So the fantasy of perfection, the fantasy of desirability, the fantasy of natural beauty, those are the kinds of fantasies that we kind of all know the beauty industry deals in. But when you get to something like the fantasy of wealth, this is a big one for me. It was a big one for me before my no-buy year. I've talked about it a bunch of times on my channel, but I had never heard anyone talking about it on their channels, and I didn't figure it out until towards the end of my no-buy year. I didn't figure out that this was one of the problematic fantasies that was causing me to spend so much money that I couldn't afford to spend. And I think that it's twofold. I think that makeup interacts with the fantasy of looking more wealthy or more successful than you already are. And I think that it also interacts with the fantasy of feeling more wealthy, temporarily feeling more successful than you already are. Now, I do know that one of the reasons that I was compelled to try to do things that made me feel temporarily more successful than I was because I felt bad about myself for being less successful than I had hoped to be at that point in my life. So I do know what I was doing in terms of like covering up shame, covering up bad feelings. But why expensive makeup? Like, why specifically? For the purpose of this video, getting into the fact that the fantasy of wealth is one of the fantasies that interacts specifically with the buying and wearing of makeup. Why? I think it's because big ticket makeup items are relatively affordable compared to big ticket other types of items. So if I was so depressed about the fact that I wasn't where I wanted to be in my life and depressed about other things that were going on in my world and in my life, and I wanted to feel fancy, there's so many things that I could have done that would have just been too expensive, like buying a really expensive sound system or piece of furniture, or like really expensive sheets for the bed, or even clothes, like really expensive clothes, designer clothes, like hundreds and hundreds of dollars that would have been involved in any of those ways of enacting this fantasy. But you can go into Sephora and get like the top of the line, the most insanely expensive eyeshadow palette, and you feel like you are in that little top percentage of people who can afford that kind of thing in that world, in the makeup world. In the rest of the world, if you back it up and you look at all of how much things cost in the world, it's just $100 or $200. You know what I mean? It's not like you've broken the bank by doing that. But inside of the world of makeup, you have done something that makes you feel rich. And that's fine if you only do it once a year. But the problem is that I was doing it over and over and over again. I was using the purchase of pieces of makeup to live constantly in that fantasy of wealth and success, to hide in that fantasy of wealth and success. And over time, as we know, all of those small purchases of the fanciest makeup added up to as much or more as it would have cost to get a sound system or a fancy piece of furniture or the fanciest sheets for my bed or designer clothing or all of the other things. So I was tricked. I tricked myself into using makeup to promote this fantasy of wealth. Oh, this one's pretty straightforward. The fantasy of youth. Our culture dramatically undervalues age. I think we've got it absolutely wrong. I think that people should become more beautiful in our eyes with every year that they age, and more respected and more worshipped. But in fact, it's the opposite. We sort of seem to depreciate as we age, especially women, and we kind of worship youth. So I think a lot of people's primary fantasy with regards to makeup is the fantasy that when they wear it, they look younger. And of course, makeup can make a person look younger. I'm not saying that the fantasy that makeup can make you look younger is delusional. It's not. It absolutely can. It's one of those ones that's kind of on the line, right? And some people are delusional about it, right? Some people put on all this makeup thinking it makes them look way, way younger, and it actually just makes them look like they're wearing a ton of makeup. It's all over the map of the definition of the word fantasy and the way in which the word fantasy can be employed. So those first five, the fantasy of perfection, the fantasy of desirability, the fantasy of natural beauty, of wealth, and of youth, those five, they all kind of ring the same bell, right? It's all kind of like we fantasize about being better in the eyes of society or better in our own eyes in this one specific way, and we either buy makeup or wear makeup or dream about makeup getting us there. The next couple that I'm going to talk about, the last two on my list, are just much, much messier than those first five. That's what I'm trying to say. These next two have strong positive qualities and then potentially negative qualities, maybe depending on how you look at it. So it's just going to be a little bit messier talking through them. Second to last on my list, I have the fantasy of temporary transformation. And this is the category title that I chose to encompass drag looks, art looks, party looks, and editorial looks, and also disguise of any kind, and stage makeup and theater makeup. For many people, the allure of makeup lies in the capacity of makeup to be an artistic tool with the human face as its canvas. I love this about makeup, and not just because I love art and I love all of the art forms and I'm really interested in different art forms, but also because I think that enacting the fantasy of temporary transformation can be incredibly powerful and life-changing. I'm especially interested in how makeup can help us to blur or cross the false boundaries of gender that are set by our society. Makeup is a dream for that. And it's not just a dream for individual people who want to engage in that. I think that it's really exciting for everybody who wants femininity to be valued as it should be in our culture, which is more highly than it already is valued, right? In our culture, we value masculinity at large a lot more than we value femininity. Makeup is connected to femininity. So playing with it or making use of it, transforming oneself with it, is in many cases a way of wallowing in femininity and celebrating femininity, no matter who's doing it. Sometimes I think about everyone who's using makeup all around the world, everyone who's playing with it, touching it, putting on their faces, and I think of all of us as like a team that's helping to push this kind of beauty, this kind of art that has been sort of sidelined or has been not given its due, hasn't been valued enough. We're all kind of like pushing it up, pushing it out into the world, and we're saying like, look at this, don't look away. It's glorious. It's one of the things I love in drag queens, because I feel like that's one of the things that drag queens are doing with makeup, with femininity, with womanhood, just pushing it forward and being like, no, don't look away, don't discount this. It is its own kind of magic. I love that makeup is there as a tool for temporary transformations that help us to disrupt and redefine cultural expectations. Even if you are just putting it on in your daily life to go about your day, it can be this as well. I'm not only talking about people who use it for art. I'm just saying that the fantasy of temporary transformation, anywhere that it exists in anyone's use of makeup, is evidence of art in the most complex sense of the word, alive in the life of that person. So of course I feel that way about drag culture in general. It's like drag culture is the poster child for that. But I do think that the fantasy of temporary transformation as a kind of fantasy that relates to makeup encompasses that and also goes beyond it. I think it's available to everyone. So actually, the way that I just talked about that bullet point, the notes that I had about the fantasy of temporary transformation weren't really complex, but I think that that bullet point kind of is made more complex by the last one that I have, which is the fantasy of identity projection. So when people see me wearing X, or when people see me looking like X, then they will know that I am X kind of person. I think that the fantasy of identity projection can take on some delusional or even destructive forms that interact with some of the other things on the list. So we talked about the fantasy of physical perfection, and there's a way to cast that in this issue, like in this fantasy. It would look like this. If I wear this foundation, then people will see my perfect skin and they will see that I am perfect in this way. They'll perceive of me as being an example of perfect womanhood, right? So it's like the fantasy of identity projection along the lines of the fantasy of physical perfection. If I wear this makeup, I will be perceived as a wealthy person, and that will be part of my identity. If I wear this makeup, then I will be perceived as young, and that will be part of my identity. So it is connected. But I am making the fantasy of identity projection a separate category because I think that in some cases, identity projection can be an exercise in self-confidence, in self-possession. It can be an exercise in empowerment. I think it can actually be something truly positive. We all know, you cannot deny that it is true that sometimes wearing X, or like wearing a certain red lipstick, for example, can make you feel more confident, more poised, more open, more present. It can really, it can change the way that you interact with the world. And that just is good, even if it's grounded in our messed up systems in which people are caused to feel insecure. This is the world we're living in, and those are the systems that we're dealing with. And I wouldn't want to take it away from people, and I don't want to take it away from myself, that sometimes wearing certain things that help you project your identity gets you where you need to go. And it can be so wonderful. It's one of the things that I truly love about makeup and fashion, like a true love that goes all the way back to my childhood, that goes all the way deep into the person that I am. And that's why I have this channel. It's not just because I want to talk about not overspending on makeup. It's because one of my favorite things in the world is like wearing that sexy turtleneck and that red lipstick that makes me feel like I can take on the world. And I think that that power, that kind of power, historically is intertwined with femininity and the people on this earth who manifest femininity. And I think that that power is vilified in our culture sometimes. And I am not going to sit here and vilify it too, because I don't think it deserves that. And that's a kind of identity projection. And so it's both. It can be messy and tough, and it can also be amazing. And I've also been thinking about this one as being related to a kind of control fantasy too. So the fantasy of identity projection sometimes has to do with a fantasy that we can control the way that other people see us. I can tell you, based on my experience editing my own YouTube footage, that when I started my YouTube channel, it turned out that this was more of a fantasy. It was more of a delusional fantasy than I ever thought it was. Before I had this bizarre experience of watching myself on video for hours and hours and hours every week, editing my own footage, before I did that, before I ever really learned like what I look like when I'm talking, I placed such a premium on the way that I made myself look when I changed my hair and my makeup and my clothes and all of this stuff. And when I started editing the footage, I realized that the thing that defines the way that I appear on camera, and I can only assume that much of that translates to being in person with me, it's not my makeup and it's not my hair and my clothes. It's the way that I act. It's the way that I talk. It's the animation of my face and the way that I move my hands. I didn't know any of this stuff before I started my YouTube channel. I didn't know what I was like. I only knew what I looked like in the mirror. I promise you, having gotten all the way to adulthood without finding this out, and then suddenly finding it out in my mid-30s when I started my YouTube channel, I promise you that your behaviors go so much further than your makeup does when it comes to the person that you are and the way that it is to be around you. So what can we do about it? Having thought about this, having talked about this, and I will say that I feel like this is much more open-ended of a discussion than the one about makeup and shame. I kind of felt like that was like boom, boom, boom. We're cooking with gas. We're listing all the things. We're done. And here I just feel like the more I think about it and the more I talk about it, the wider the gyre gets. But what I think we can do about it is this. We can notice fantasy when it comes into play in our processes with makeup, the process of applying it and the process of buying it. So actually, let's go back to the definition of fantasy that we started with, the one that I gave you at the beginning of the video. So fantasy has to do with imagination. In its barest definition, the faculty for or the act of imagining something. So it can have this wonderful quality. Fantasy can be this, like, I wouldn't want to live without it. Conceiving of something and then bringing it to life, that's art. That's what I live for. You know what I mean? Like, fantasy is an important building block of the kind of life that I want to have. But then there's the other connotation, the kind of the rest of the definition, which has to do with dreaming about something that is actually not attainable. And I think, and I'm just kind of positing this here at the end of the video, and then you guys can tell me what you think, but I think that maybe sorting the healthy from the unhealthy in the realm of fantasy with regards to makeup might have to do with figuring out which kind of fantasy it is that's spurring you to buy the makeup you're buying in any given moment, wear the makeup you're wearing in any given moment. I think that it could be really helpful in the future if I'm about to buy another lipstick, if I were to ask myself, which of the many fantasies that are connected to makeup am I catering to with this purchase? I think that if I had asked myself that question in advance of buying every piece of makeup I've ever bought, and if I'd been honest with myself, half, maybe more than half of them I never would have bought, because I would have realized that I was catering to a fantasy that is the kind that you'll only ever be chasing, and that just won't manifest in anything, like won't manifest in art, won't manifest in confidence and self-expression and identity projection in a way that can really grow someone and get someone places, but rather that just the buying of the thing was an attempt to grab onto a fantasy that can't be grasped. That's kind of all I've got. I hope that this wasn't too roundabout. I hope that I've given us enough to actually kind of talk about and to toss around in the comment section down below. Please let me know your thoughts. That I might have bitten off a little more than I can chew with this video, I feel like. I just jumped in and I did it. And if I feel like it's been inconclusive, if you guys feel like it's been inconclusive, then maybe I'll keep going. We can keep talking about it. I'm not trying to present myself here as some sort of expert. I just want to know what you think. Thank you so much for being here and watching this. I appreciate y'all so much. And I hope that you are remembering to take extra good care of yourselves so that you can all be the most effective versions of yourselves as you do your work in the world.